Hello listeners, this video focuses E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. There's another novel with a similar name, only the latter part of the novel's name differs, that is A Passage to England, which is written by an Indian author, Nirad C. Chowdhury. E.M. Forster's full name is Edward Morgan Forster. He was born in the year 1879 and died in the year 1970. He was an English author. He is best known for his novels, particularly A Room with a View in the year 1908, Howard's End 1910. He was a most successful novelist during Edwardian era. There is another famous novel of him, Where Angels Fear to Tread. This he published in the year 1905. This phrase, where angels fear to tread, is taken from Alexander Poem's essay, An Essay on Criticism. So there is a phrase, for fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Forster was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 20 separate years. Most of his novels examine class difference and hypocrisy. Let us see a small outline of this novel, A Passage to India. This is a novel published in 1924. This novel is set against the backdrop of British Raj. British Raj is mentioned because it was the rule of the British Crown on the Indian subcontinent. It is also called as Crown Rule in India or Direct Rule in India, which lasted between 1858 to 1947. So after that, we had independence from the colonizers. The novel has the backdrop of British Raj and the Indian independence movement in the 1920s. This novel was selected as one of the 100 great works of 20th century English literature by the Modern Library. Modern Library is an American book publishing imprint. Forster has taken this title, A Passage to India, from Walt Whitman's 1870 poem, Passage to India. This Passage to India is a poetry collection which Walt Whitman published in the year 1871. The poetry collection of Walt Whitman appeared in Leaves of Grass. The story revolves around four characters. They are Dr. Aziz. Aziz has a British friend named Mr. Cyril Fielding and Mrs. Moore and Miss Adela. The novel details on the boiling situation that happens during the British Raj and Indian independence. So it has major themes on racial tensions and prejudices between Indians and the British during the colonial era. Forster writes his book after his visit to India in 1912-13. At that time, he was a private secretary to Tukojirao III. He was the ruling Maharajah of the Maratha princely state of Dewas from 1900 to 1937. Forster dedicated this book to his friend Rose Massoud. Let us see the characters of this novel. Dr. Aziz. He is a young Muslim doctor in Chandrapur who is a widower with 3 children. Dr. Aziz has a passion for poetry. Cyril Fielding. Cyril Fielding is the English principal of the government college. Fielding is an independent and open-minded man who likes to travel. Adela Questard. She is a young, honest English woman who comes to India to decide whether or not to marry Ronnie. Mrs. Moore is an elderly English woman who is the mother of Ronnie, Ralph and Stella. Ronnie Heaslop, he is Mrs. Moore's son and the magistrate at Chandrapur. Miss Direk, she is a young English woman who works for an English Maharani. Mr. McBride, he is the superintendent of police. He has his own thought of pursuing Indians as criminals. There are other minor characters in the novel. Professor God Boli, he is a Brahmin Hindu professor at Fielding's College. Mr. Turton, He's an English collector or chief British official who governs Chandrapur. Mrs. Turton, she is the wife of Mr. Turton, Major Calendar. He is a British civil surgeon and the superior of Aziz. Aziz is an inferior doctor to Major Calendar. Calendar is especially prejudiced. He hates Indians. He is boastful. Hamidullah is Aziz's uncle and a good friend. Hamidullah was educated at Cambridge and he becomes the close friends with an English couple there. Muhammad Ali, he is the friend of Aziz and a lawyer who is dramatic and emotional. Muhammad Latif, he is a distant cousin of Hamidullah. Let us see the other minor characters while we deal with a summary. The novel has 3 parts consisting 37 chapters. This video contains the summary of the whole novel. The novel takes place in the early 1900s, that was during the period of colonialism. As the novel began, Aziz, he is a young Muslim doctor in the town of Chandrapur. He has a discussion with his friends of whether it is possible for an Englishman and an Indian to be friends. According to Aziz, he finds the Englishmen to be amusing, but on the other hand, he finds them to be rude. So that was the time Adela Questard and the elderly Mrs. Moore, they arrive from England. Adela has a plan of marrying Rooney Heathlock, who is the son of Mr. Moore. He is an official in Chandrapur. The 2 women, they arrive to India in order to club and express a desire to see the real India. That night, Mrs. Moore and Aziz happen to meet in a local mosque and feel an instant connection. Mr. Turton, who's present in the club, and he is the English collector, he hosts a party at the club and invites some Indians to meet Mrs. Moore and Adela. Cyril Fielding, he is a principal of the government college, is impressed by Adela's friendliness toward Indians and he invites her and Mrs. Moore to have tea. Between this, through Mrs. Moore, Adela happens to meet Aziz. So even during the tea party, Adela requests to call Aziz. Before the tea party could start, Aziz and Fielding, they happened to meet each other and they had good conversation and they got along with each other. At this time, the Hindu professor Godball, Adela and Mrs. Moore joined together and the party was very smooth until the arrival of Roni, because Roni behaves rude to the Indians. That evening, Adela thinks about the behavior of Roni and decides not to marry Roni. That same night, the two ended up in a car accident. The excitement of the later incidents made Adela to change her mind of marrying Roni. Aziz, the local doctor, he arranges a day trip to Marabar Caves for Fielding's tea party group. So the same tea party group are invited for the trip to Marabar Caves. Marabar Caves is a fictional place created by E.M. Forster, and during the arrival of the trip, Fielding and Professor Godball, they miss the train. So Aziz goes alone with Adela and Mrs. Moore. Reaching near the caves, they start to have a ride with an elephant and they had a picnic. They also visited some of the caves and the ancient buildings. Those buildings seem unfriendly to them. During their visit to the new places, Mrs. Moore had a strange encounter towards people and she becomes disturbed by the cave's echo. This puts her depressed, and when Aziz and Adela accompanied with a guide, she stayed at the back of them. As they had adventurous cave visit, Adela, when she walks, she realizes that she doesn't love Rumi. Adela, with all of illusions about marriage, she starts a conversation with Aziz. She asks Aziz whether he has more than one wife. Aziz considers this question offensive. Suddenly, he walks into a nearby cave to recover and to act normal. And when he comes out of the cave, he finds Adila has gone. He could only find Adila's broken field glasses and then sees her at the bottom of the hill. Now, Fielding has also arrived to the spot. Aziz gets back down to the picnic site to speak with Fielding. During the return, Adila had hurried herself back to Chandrapur by car. All others, they took train back to Chandrapur. When they all arrived to Chandrapur, Aziz is arrested and charged with assaulting Adila in the cave. The English people, they come together, they feel patriotic towards their countrymen, and they become anti-Indian. Fielding alone believes Aziz to be innocent, but Fielding's support angers the Englishmen because Fielding is the only one to defend Aziz's innocence. Mrs. Moore, who's already haunted by the cave's echo, she had illusion of again hearing the cave's echo even after reaching Chandrapur. So the sound of cave's echo grows irritable and apathetic. Similarly, Attila is also illusioned of hearing the cave's echo. Roni, observing his mother's behavior, he gets anger and arranges for her return to England. During the journey, Mrs. Mood dies. During the trial in court, Aziz is tensed and chaotic, and when Adila is questioned in court, she declares that she was mistaken and declares that Aziz did not attack her in the cave. Now by this, Aziz is released. The Indians, they celebrate Aziz's release. Following this, Fielding takes Adila to the government college where Adila spends the next several weeks. Fielding starts to observe the brave nature of Adila and began to respect her. He thus appreciated her bravery of pronouncing Aziz innocent before everyone. At this point, Roni breaks off his engagement to Adila and Adila returns to England. During this time, Aziz had developed likeness towards Adila, but when Fielding starts to talk about Adila, he feels betrayed. When Adila moves back to England, Fielding also sails to England, and Aziz in Chandrapur, he suspects that he will marry Adila in England. 2 years pass by. Aziz has started to live in Mau. Mau is a Hindu area. At this point, he grows more patriotic towards his nation and develops anti-Britishism. He deeply wanted India to be united and to get independence. He just assumes that Fielding had married Adila, and at this point, Fielding visits Mau with his wife and brother-in-law. Now, when Aziz encounters them, he is much surprised to know that Fielding had actually married Stella Moore, who is the daughter of Mrs. Moore. Meantime, there was an important Hindu festival that takes place in town. Aziz is more fascinated with Stella's brother, who is the brother-in-law of Fielding, named Ralph Moore, and he takes him on the lake to see the festival. When Aziz and Fielding had a boat ride separately, Aziz's boat crashes. The two men, that is Aziz and Fielding, they started to communicate and they had a final ride together. Aziz, as he has grown much patriotic towards his nation, he declares that once the English leave India, then he and Fielding can be friends. Though they wanted to become friends now, but the sky and the earth seem to separate them and say not yet. The novel closes with the phrase, no, not yet, no, not there. The themes of the novel are colonialism. As we read the novel has more in-depth description of daily life in India under the British rule. During the British Raj, the English people had a strong determination of civilizing the nations which they have colonized. So the Indians are put under racism, they are seen as criminals. There is another important theme in this novel, that is friendship. So, despite the strong political overtones, there was a relevant subject of friendship between some important characters in the novel, especially between Aziz and Fielding. They have good interpersonal kindness, division, and unity, because there was a clear division between English and Indian, race and culture. This novel portrays the different ethnography and portrays the different customs of different cultures, especially Hinduism and Muslimism. Hope this video helps. If you have query or suggestion, write it down below. Thank you for listening.